All right, hello everyone. Again, welcome to another flipped lesson. Today's focus is going to be on textual analysis, specifically discussing storyline and viewpoint. All right, so let's get started with storyline. So most of the time when you think about storyline, you don't really think about poetry. Most people think it's strange to talk about a storyline. However, we look at poetry, just like any novel or short story. Most poems usually have a storyline, whether it's a narrative poem, whether it's a ballad, whether it's a specific type of other type of poem. But typically, there is a storyline to the poem. All right, and so when we look at that storyline, we want to try to analyze the poem. You don't want to necessarily say it's definitely X or Y, but we want to try to interpret the poem, to pull out the meaning, and to analyze it a bit further. All right, so and there are a number of steps that you want to make sure you follow when we're trying to analyze a particular poem on more than one level. Obviously, there's the literal level of the poem, which means some things in the poem are meant to be taken literally. And then there are times when you have to delve a little bit deeper in the poem and to look at the true meaning and the message in the poem. So, on your first reading, sometimes you just want to gain a feeling for the atmosphere or the emotion of the poem, and poetry is often meant to be read more than just one time. Oftentimes, you have to read a poem multiple times to try to make sense of it, to extract the inferencing that is embedded in the poem that's meant for the reader to pull out. Oftentimes, when you read it a second time, you might want to look to see if there's something happening in the poem. What is the poet or character doing in the poem? And then on the third reading, you might want to look a little bit deeper. Does the poet create a metaphor? Is the poem really about something else? What is embedded in this poem, and what am I supposed to pull out from these words or phrases that are being used in the poem? All right. So at times, you want to be able to ask yourself questions. So we're going to look at a poem called The Crossing Bar. And we looked at the structure of a poem similar to this before, but now we're going to look at a number of questions that you should consider when reading this poem and any other poem. All right, so the first thing we want to look at is what is the atmosphere that the poet is trying to create. What we mean by atmosphere, we're talking about the tone or the mood that is being set. And how does the character seem to be feeling in the poem? Then the next question we want to look at is, what is this poem literally about? Is this, something on the surface of the story? Like, what is the literal meaning? Then once you get beyond the literal meaning, okay, now we need to take this and look at what is the deeper meaning. Could this be an extended metaphor that could actually be something else? And what does that metaphor mean? What is the poet trying to say through this piece? And so these are the questions that I want you to consider and think about when we're reading this poem called The Crossing Bar. So when you're taking notes, you may want to take notes on these three questions. Writing your answers to what the atmosphere is that the poet is creating. What does he seem to be feeling? What is the poem literally about? What is the surface of the story about? What is the deeper meaning? So when I'm looking at your notes, I really want to look for the answers to these questions. So if you need to pause or come back to it to record your answers in your notes, that's fine as well. All right. So let's look at this story, the poem, and let's look at the storyline in The Crossing Bar. Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea. But such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. Twilight and evening bell, and after that the dark. And may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. For though from out our bourne of time and place the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. And this is written by Alfred Lloyd Tennyson. All right, so let's go back to the beginning of the poem. Well, obviously, first of all, we could look at the title, which is called Crossing the Bar. Okay, so obviously as a reader, you should immediately say, well, what is the bar that he's actually crossing? And then what we want to do, and when we look at a poem, is what is the literal meaning here? What is actually going on? So if we look at the first stanza, sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea. So immediately here, when I look at this last line of the first stanza, when I put out to sea, what is he talking about when I put out to sea? And see if you can figure out what he means when he says that. What does the literal mean? What's going on here? But such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out of the boundless deep turns again home. So what is he talking about? What is this boundless deep referring to? What is the meaning here? And what does he mean by turns again home? So obviously there's some inferencing here that we can get into about, is this possibly about a ship that's out to sea? And when he talks about this boundless deep, is that the ocean that he's referring to? And is this ship turning home again? Is that a possibility? All right, something to consider. Let's look at the last part. Twilight and evening bell, and after that the dark. And may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. So is someone sad about this person leaving? Or what? Or is there some sadness? What are they sad about? That's the kind of questions you want to ask. For though from out our bourne of time and place, the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I've crossed the bar. So who is this pilot and why is it capitalized? And what is this bar that he's crossing? What could be the deeper meaning in this poem? So again, kind of make some inferences, take those notes and see if you can pull it out. So here's a question that I want you to consider. What sort of atmosphere does a poet create in this story, and how does he seem to be feeling? Don't want you to record the answer. All I want you to do is think about that question. So I want you to think about it. The next question. What is the poem literally about? What is the surface story? What is the literal meaning of this poem? So again, I want you to record this answer in your notes. And then lastly, what deeper meaning might there be? Could the whole poem be an extended metaphor? If so, what does this metaphor mean, and what is the poet trying to say? That would be your last note in reference to storyline. All right, so moving on. Now we're going to talk a little bit about viewpoint, and then we'll wrap up. So viewpoint describes the point of view from which a poem is written. Just as a novel or writer might use a first or third person narrative, the same thing can happen in a poem. So a poet will use a real and invented character to tell their story. Some poems could be a mixture of viewpoints. It could actually shift between first person viewpoint to third person viewpoint. What we need to do is make sure we understand the differences of the viewpoint between first person, third person, and omniscient viewpoint. All right, so let's talk about those differences. So when we talk about first person is easy to identifiable because the writer is talking directly to the reader. You want to see words like I, my, me, and so on. Whereas third person viewpoint, the poet is a little bit more distant, like he's talking through the character. So it's words like he, she, him, or her. And then finally you have omniscient viewpoint. Whereas the viewpoint, the poet is even farther away from the reader and from his or her subject. The poem is written using his viewpoint, might provide a description without any sense of character. So I kind of equate this to a video game. First person, you're actually kind of the view of the character. You are the character. Third person, the camera backs away a little bit more, and now you can see the actual character and you manipulate the character. And then when you look at omniscient viewpoint, you're kind of omniscient, meaning omnipresent, all-seeing, all-knowing, kind of godlike. So when you talk about omniscient viewpoint, it's not really told from the viewpoint of the character or from the viewpoint of the actual speaker, but it's almost this all-knowing over view of the person. So it's a bit farther away from the reader. All right, so let's look at that into action. And we're going to look at some 3 examples. And then remember, when you're discussing a poem, it's important to say why the poet uses this technique. Why do you think he uses this first person or third person or omniscient? Is viewpoint? Is there some significance in terms of using that viewpoint or telling the poem or the story from that viewpoint? Will it detract from the actual message if I were to shift from a first person to a third person? Does it add some sense of value to the poem by utilizing this viewpoint instead of a different viewpoint? So those are some things to consider. All right, so let's look at a couple examples. This is first person. This is called the Old Stoic. Riches I hold in light esteem, and love I laugh to scorn, and lust of fame was but a dream that vanished with the morn. And if I pray, the only prayer that moves my lips from me is leave the heart that now I bear and give me liberty. So that's first person. You can see the eyes throughout it. So he's telling the story as if he is the character. All right, let's look at another example. Third person. The blessed damozel. The blessed damozel, I leaned out from the gold bar of heaven. Her eyes were deeper than the depths of water, stilled at even. She had 3 lilies in her hand, and the stars in her hair were 7. So now you can see that's his third person because of the use of her in the poem, the repeated use of her and she. So that's how you could tell this third person. And then finally, omniscient, God's grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck this rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. Very complicated poem there. We're not going to attempt to extrapolate and understand it for the point of this conversation, but you can see how it's omniscient. It's the author is a little bit further away from the reader. He's not talking from the perspective of being the character. He's not, close in, but it's not using first or third person. It's a bit farther off. So hopefully you've taken these notes on what we've discussed with storyline, also what we've discussed with different types of viewpoints, and you've also taken the poems that we discussed and you've taken notes on those questions. And don't forget to turn these notes in to Edmodo.